All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started here. It's not looking like we're going to have anybody joining us in real time virtually, but that's kind of one of the perks of being able to do this virtually is that I can record these and post them for you guys to go back and kind of watch whenever it's convenient for you at your leisure. So maybe we'll have some people kind of pop in throughout the session here. And if so, then we'll get to do some of the more interactive type things that I had planned. If not, then I'll just kind of have to back up and punt in a few places. But that's kind of part of the game. So anyways, if you are joining after the fact, if you're watching this via recording, if you will take the time to visit this link right over here, this SurveyMonkey link, and type in your name, and if you're faculty or staff, I think it's 4 or 5 questions, but do please take the time to fill that out so that I know who has accessed the video. You'll get credit for PD for it, and I'll be able to kind of keep track of who's taking advantage of these opportunities. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in here and get started. All right, so the topic at hand today is hacking the lesson plan, looking at how to effectively and efficiently plan a lesson. So our objectives, we are going to kind of briefly talk about the benefits of lesson planning. Then we will look at a lesson plan template, which kind of takes a few different components and puts them into a one-page template for us to use. We're going to talk about some different ways that we can utilize that template. And throughout the process, the plan was to kind of have you guys throw some strategies that you use out there. I do have kind of a collection of strategies in an annotated template version that I'll be sending out along with the link to this recording. So maybe we'll have some people pop in on us and throw some of their strategies out. If not, then I have a small collection of strategies that you can use for each kind of phase of the lesson template that we're going to be talking about today. I did have a couple of polls that I was going to do here, so we'll skip through those and just go ahead and start talking about what are the benefits of lesson planning. Why should I spend my time and effort doing this? So planning a lesson really focuses your instruction on specific outcomes and objectives, and more or less kind of charts an instructional path for you to follow so that you're not kind of all over the place in your presentation from within one lesson and then over the course of the semester, right? So if I'm planning lessons on a consistent basis, then over the course of a semester, then my course is going to be kind of more focused and more cohesive. Lesson plans create presentations and create class sessions that have more structure to them that students really need. That increases their confidence in you as an instructor and increases their satisfaction with you if they can see that you have planned a lesson. And trust me that when you plan a lesson versus when you don't plan a lesson, they can tell. It's fairly obvious. And we're going to watch a little clip, just about a 90-second clip here in just a second that'll kind of illustrate what I'm talking about there. And when you plan a lesson, it facilitates this thought process that produces a more logical and systematic presentation of your material. So let's go ahead and take a look at this clip so you can kind of see what I'm referring to about being able to tell when a teacher is unprepared. And this is a little hyperbolic. This is a little over the top, but it's not too far-fetched in terms of what our students are kind of comprehending or seeing when we come to class unprepared.
Well, hi everybody here in Cumberland. I'm trying to figure out what I want to do today. I'm not exactly... Okay, I think we'll just talk about this thing with, like, I don't know, maybe market segmentation, where, like, last time we were talking about, like, demographics. Do you remember that when we were talking about demographics? I can't really remember exactly what we were saying last time. But we were saying something about people and the different characteristics of people and the different population, and I don't know, we're going to have to go over this really quickly. We've got market segmentation, geographic, demographic, psychographic behavior, all those different kinds of things. You probably remember that from last time, not really sure, but let me just show you a website that talks to you a little bit about well, you'll see what I mean. It shows you a really good demographic example, and it's a Nokia product. I didn't have time to come in here and get it together ahead of time. But I'm going to just search it, just do a quick Google search. It'll be fine. I'm going to do a quick Google search to show you something here. So this Nokia... Wait a minute, let me do a... It's a product called Vertu. Should come up right away. So, hold on a second.
Okay, so obviously that is a little bit exaggerated, but I've been there when you have those class periods where you just really did not have time to really prepare like you usually do. And sometimes it does go quite that bad. And trust me, students can pick up on that, and they do. And then they also pick up on when you are prepared. So I'm not suggesting that if you don't have a lesson plan, then that's what's going to happen. Just kind of pointing out, the benefits of preparing ahead of time. So when you have complex topics, obviously planning a lesson and the preparation process is going to kind of facilitate more of a linear progression through these complex topics. So we're not kind of, instead of working our way through the maze, we kind of take a shortcut, and it creates this foundation for scaffolding. So both, again, within one lesson and then over the course of the semester, we have this scaffolding that kind of builds upon itself, where we start with foundational material and then build upon it. And lesson planning really does help to secure the scaffolding structures. It also kind of, going through this process, it also kind of points out to us and highlights the areas where there might be some confusion, some misalignments, both in the way that we understand things, or maybe the way that our students will understand things. And, just kind of points out those areas that might be problem areas before they become problem areas, right? If there's going to be something that is off, or something that's misaligned, or some sort of misconception, then we would rather notice that and come to see that in the planning stages, rather than in a classroom full of students when we're presenting this material. And then, you can be like this cool guy kangaroo after a certain period of time of lesson planning. So first of all, the more you do something, the better you get at it, right? So even with this one-page template, it's still going to be, the first few times you do it, a little bit tedious and a little bit time-consuming, but the more that you put yourself through this process, the more that you use not necessarily this template, but just any template in any process, the more that you plan lessons, the better you'll get at it. And then over the course of time, you're going to build up a wealth of resources that you can use, kind of revising them a little bit along the way. But, again, the more you do it, the better you get at it, the less you're going to have to go back and revise these things. So you create these lesson plans, you tuck them away, you file them away, and you kind of tweak them based on student needs from one semester to the next, and the kind of feedback that you get. And, maybe some of them you just kind of chunk all together, but you have something to go back and look at that is well organized, well formatted, and at a certain point you can just kind of sit back and get in chill mode. So this is the template that I'm sharing with you today. I sent the Word document out via email so that you have access to download this and edit it. And let's just kind of go through a quick overview here and look at the different sections. So we'll start off by talking about the importance of objectives and kind of how to construct objectives. And then very closely related to that, essential questions. So what kind of questions do you want students to ponder throughout the lesson? And then what do you want them to be able to answer by the end of the lesson? And then we're going to take our actual presentation and break it down into 3 segments. So you've got before segment, where you're going to activate the student's prior knowledge. You've got the during segment, which is kind of where the actual instruction takes place. And then you have the after segment, which is where you're going to assess both the content of the lesson and also your teaching practices from time to time. And then down here at the bottom, we have, really this is kind of just to hold yourself accountable more than anything, because you do want to have some handouts, some guided notes, some sort of graphic organizer to keep your students on task and kind of focused and engaged in what's going on. And then you want to intentionally plan for interaction and engagement with your students. So as you go through the phases up here, you just kind of use these 2 spaces to more or less archive and compile lists of what are the things that you are doing to engage your students, and what kind of opportunities for interaction are you offering throughout the lesson. So by far the most important piece of the lesson planning process is defining your objectives. And if you go through the Quality Matters certification process, then you'll get a lot more information about the importance of objectives and how to create objectives. But today we'll talk about both of those things just pretty quickly, both the importance and then how to construct them. So the objectives are going to guide your entire planning process, right? So it's really kind of beginning with the end in mind. It's what do you want the students to be able to do or accomplish or answer by the end of the lesson. And again, that's going to guide your instructional, what instructional strategies you select, what assessment strategies you select. And it's also going to kind of serve as a point of retreat, right? So when you're going through this process, you're going to get frustrated and stuck from time to time, and having good objectives are going to give you a spot to kind of go back to and say, all right, let me refocus. This is what I'm trying to accomplish. So let me focus on these objectives and base everything off of these and move forward with this as my starting point. And the SMART acronym, really the specific and measurable part of this is more applicable to what we're going to be talking about today. But good objectives are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So we'll talk more about the specific and measurable here in just a second. Achievable and realistic, that's, kind of alluding to the fact that you need to take into account the developmental level of your student. If you're teaching a intro level math class or developmental math class, then obviously there are certain objectives that you would want to kind of avoid for students that would be in that type class. Timely is kind of set for us because we're constrained to a semester at a time. So I'm going to add to this, though, that you want them to be student-centered, concise, and you want to have between 3 and 5. So by student-centered, I mean a lot of times you'll have, for instance, an objective that might say, explain the process of mitosis. Well, that's not really student-centered. That's what you're doing, right? Unless you then go back and ask the student to actually explain that process. But more often than not, you're the one that's going to be explaining the process of mitosis or whatever the process may be, but the student will never be asked to actually explain that process with any type of assessment. So, and that's another, aspect of it is you want to make sure that your assessment does align with your objectives. You want them to be concise. You don't want to use a lot of big fancy words, and you don't want to measure more than one competency with one objective, right? So you don't want to have an objective that says something to the effect of the student will identify and analyze the components of this process, and then using these components will create a model to utilize the components. So that's, identify, analyze, create, utilize. There's a lot of things going on there. So instead of having one objective with multiple competencies, just take all of those competencies and break them into separate objectives. And also make sure that those things are measurable, right? So notice I said identify, analyze, create. These are things that can be measured, right? So you don't want to use words like understand or appreciate or phrases like will learn how to. So make sure that you are using action verbs that can be measured. The next couple of slides are just really kind of more resources for those of you that that choose to download the slides and kind of use these resources moving forward. This is just a template for creating objectives. Use a verb, have some sort of subject, and then include some sort of context. And you can kind of see here how this is color coded. So my verb is that the student will be able to calculate. My subject of the objective is x-intercepts for a quadratic function. And then my context is that we're talking about within a certain module, and we're going to be factoring to accomplish this calculation of x-intercepts. So just kind of gives you kind of a template formula, so to speak, for creating objectives. And then you have this resource as well that provides you with lots of action verbs that are measurable, and they are categorized by levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So moving on to the next section of the template, essential questions are going to be very closely related and linked to your objectives. Again, you want these to be student-friendly, just the same that you want your objectives to be student-friendly, but these are going to be explicitly communicated with your students, so they need to be even more student-friendly than the objectives. And all we're really doing here is we're taking the objectives and we are rephrasing them in the form of a question, and communicating them with our students, maybe through the syllabus or at the beginning of a lesson, or maybe you kind of just print them out on a little half sheet of paper and pass them out. But it's a way to focus your student and orient the student to the topic of the lesson, and it gives them a way as they're moving out, when they're moving throughout the lesson, it kind of helps them to focus on the big picture and how all the little things that are being presented to them throughout the lesson, how all those little things fit into the bigger picture, right? So these need to be kind of broad and overarching. That way everything kind of fits together like puzzles, like puzzle pieces as you're moving through. And again, I spoke earlier about having your objectives being your retreat point when you kind of get frustrated. And so this kind of serves as a retreat point for your students as they get frustrated about, where is this fitting in, and why are we talking about this? And I don't understand how this fits into the overall picture of what we're talking about today. They can kind of go back to their essential questions, and that kind of reorients them to the big picture. So as an example, these are the objectives and the essential questions for the session that we're in right now. And I use this template for everything that I do, and have kind of used this template for a while, because all of the templates that I was given were multiple pages long, and I didn't really care for them. So I just kind of took an amalgamation of a lot of different templates and the parts that I liked, and kind of combined them into this. But anyway, so our objectives we've already talked about, right? Identify the benefits of lesson planning. So an essential question for that could be, why is it important to plan a lesson? Identify the components of a lesson plan. What are the components of an effective lesson? Utilize a lesson planning template. How can I quickly and easily plan a lesson? And create a list of strategies to be used in each phase of the lesson. What strategies can I use in the delivery of the lesson? So you can kind of see here how all I've done is taken each one of the objectives, rephrased it as a question that's very easy to understand. And again, I would communicate these at the beginning of a lesson, and probably kind of revisit them as I answered them throughout the lesson. Throw it back up on the board and say, remember we talked about these are the questions that we need to be focusing on. Okay, well, here's the answer, or part of the answer to essential question 1. Again, this was one of the engagement activities we were going to do. And if you haven't checked out Padlet, I highly recommend that you do. So I'll just kind of give you a brief overview of how Padlet works. So there's a link here to Padlet that would take you to this page. Okay, so essential question 1 is what everyone would be addressing here. So why is it important to plan a lesson? So if we had several people involved in this virtual webinar, like attending virtually, then everyone could go to this centralized location here and add their thoughts. So why is it important to plan a lesson? Focuses instruction. Okay, so something fairly simple there. And then we have a collection of everybody's thoughts in a centralized location, right? So it's something that's very quick and easy to use, and it's free, and especially in distance formats or blended or hybrid formats, is a way to kind of collaborate across time and across space. All right, back to our lesson. So now we are getting into the actual lesson itself, right? So everything that we've talked about up to this point is just kind of here's the template. Here are the pieces of the template. We're going to start with our objectives and our essential questions, and now we are into the lesson. So you need to have some sort of activity for every class session that activates the student's prior knowledge, right? It serves as the foundation for scaffolding, both within that one lesson and throughout the course of the semester. And you can use these activities to kind of draw the students in And if you don't get them hooked on the lesson, if you don't draw their attention early, then that fun activity that you have, for the during portion, right? 20 minutes, 30 minutes into the lecture, when you're going to have them get into small groups or pairs or whatever, then by the time you get there, you've lost them, right? You've lost them within the first 5 minutes, and they're going to participate, but they are not going to participate to the level that they might have if you had hooked them right from the get-go and got their juices flowing right from the very beginning. For those of you that do blended formats or flipped formats, this is a perfect opportunity to hold your students accountable for those things that you're asking them to do outside of class, right? So not only are you activating their prior knowledge, but you're also holding them accountable for watching the video or taking the quiz or reading the material that you assign for them to do outside of class. And also, this is the beginning stages of facilitating schema. So what is a schema? All right, so each one of these little pieces of each one of these little shapes here represents a different piece of information, right? So when your students come into class, regardless of how well you teach, they are going to come into class with the content that you taught last time and the content that's associated with the content that you're teaching. It's all going to be scattered just like you see here, right? And what this before segment of the lesson is for is to kind of get us somewhere between this image and this image, right? And we're not going to be able to just in the first 5-10 minutes of class with some low stakes quiz or some sort of do these 3 to 5 problems that are similar to what we talked about last time. That's not going to get us all the way from here to where we have everything nice and organized into a nice knowledge structure, but it's gonna move us from left to right, right? So it's beginning to get the green pieces all down to the bottom and the white pieces all close to the same level, and we're moving from left to right so that eventually, and again, moving from the first image to this last image is not going to happen in one lesson or 2 lessons, or even a semester. This type of relationship where you have all these different schema that are connected in this type of way. This is, how you have your knowledge constructed. You are a content expert, so you have all these little schemas that are connected to other little schemas across content, and you've developed this over many years and through many hours of practice. So what we're trying to do is really just to kind of get a little more organized than this mess here, right? And so that's something that your before strategies can help you to do. And again, we'll skip over this Padlet activity and move in. Oh, I'm sorry. So this is an example of what my before column looks like. This is a snapshot of the before column for my lesson plan template for this session. So my activate prior knowledge strategy was to use the polls that we skipped there in those first few slides. So what I usually do for my before column is to put whatever kind of strategy or tool that I'm using up here in bold, and then just a brief kind of description of how I'm going to use that. So, with these templates, It's, everybody's going to have different ways that they like to do things. And, maybe you take the template and change it up completely somehow. So I'm not going to try and, give you a one size fits all. This is how you format the before column. But, over the course of several years, I've found that for me, I usually only use one strategy or one tool for my before activities. So I'll take whatever strategy or tool I'm using, list it in bold, and then kind of give myself just a brief overview of exactly how it is that I'm using that tool or strategy. So moving into the during portion of the lesson, this is where instruction takes place. This is what I call the meat and potatoes of the lesson. And first and foremost, you want to make sure that you plan for interaction with your students. You want to make sure that you plan for, so when I talk about interaction with your students, that takes place in a couple of different ways. So you want your students to be interacting with you, you want your students to be interacting with one another, and you want your students to be interacting with the content. Okay, so that's three different ways that you want interaction to occur, and I'll say those again. You want your students to be interacting with you, you want your students to be interacting with one another, and you want your students to be interacting with the content. And those things may or may not naturally occur within a lesson, and more often than not, at least one or two out of the three will, but the natural occurrence of interaction does not facilitate the learning process in the same way as it will when you plan for those interactions to happen, and you have structured those interactions, and you have activities to take place for each type of interaction. So yes, interaction can and often does take place naturally, especially for people that have been teaching for a while and they just kind of know how to cause those interactions to happen again naturally. However, planning those interactions and planning what's going to happen during those interactions and what kind of prompts and what kind of thought processes am I going to facilitate for each one of those three different types of interaction is going to help that the learning process, and is going to facilitate that construction of schema that we talked about. You also want to plan for formative assessments. This can be anything as simple as just kind of walking around the room and making observations and making little comments about student work or group work or just really anything, but you want to make sure that you're planning for that in your lesson. You want to begin the feedback loop here, and we'll talk about what the feedback loop is starting here and then ending with the after segment of the lesson. So the feedback loop starts with two questions. What is good and not good about the student's work? And then, I guess, one question and one statement. So the feedback loop begins with what is good and not good, and then a suggestion for how to make it better, right? So you want to plan into your presentation or your lesson ways and opportunities for you to evaluate students' work, let them know what's good and bad, and then ways to offer suggestions, whether that be in a one-on-one type situation or a whole class situation. You do want to begin your feedback loop here. And then always try and summarize your key points. And this is something that I've always struggled with because I'm, as you can likely tell, fairly long-winded. So I'll plan for the summarization and then usually run out of time for it. But do try and keep yourself less long-winded than I, and work that summary in. Again, skipping over the Padlet activity and moving on to an example of how to format the during column of your template. So what I usually do is just a really bare bones outline here, and I really use this as kind of the starting point for my actual when I go to create the PowerPoint or whatever I might be using to actually teach the lesson. So what I've found is that when I force myself to create an outline that will fit into this column, then it really makes me pare information down and take, multiple concepts and group them together. And then I can take this and kind of expand on it a little bit with my presentation, rather than starting with the PowerPoint or whatever you use for your presentation and then taking that and paring it down. I kind of start with the bare bones outline and build out from there. Again, that's just kind of the way that I have went about doing things. In terms of actual creating presentations, I do suggest this website, Presentation Zen. This guy has some really good tips, some pretty good TED Talks, and if you're one that kind of struggles with creating your own materials, I highly recommend giving this page a look. This one has, I think, 10 tips, and you can see here, paragraph. It's not very long, but some really, really good stuff here. I also forgot to share this site with you as well. Going back to that schema construction that I was talking about earlier. Schema construction is a smaller part of a larger concept called cognitive load, and this is just a really good blog that I find myself returning to quite often. So if you just search e-learning coach and cognitive load, then you can get here. And this lady Connie Malamed has a pretty brief but succinct description of both cognitive load and schema construction. So kind of got off on a tangent there. So back to the during column again. Just a bare bones outline for me. I always highlight the interactive opportunities that I'm going to include, just to make sure that when I get done, if I don't see a lot of yellow on my template, then I know, hey, I probably need to go back and find some spots where I can work in some interaction and some engagement opportunities for the participants. All right, so after we have taught our lesson, it is time to do a couple of things. First and foremost, going back to this schema construction, once we form these schema and we convert them from our working memory to our long-term memory, so first of all, long-term memory has an unlimited storage capacity. So we can store as much information there as we can possibly ever hope to. It is our ability to retrieve that information that really is what constitutes learning, right? So just because I have some information stored makes absolutely no difference if I can't go back and retrieve that information when I need to. And the only way that I'm going to be able to retrieve that information is if I continue to do so over and over and over, right? So it really doesn't matter how good you are at structuring your lessons, how good you are at engaging your students and formatting your presentations. If you do not force them to retrieve the information that you have taught them, then it will be lost. Okay, so there's also research that shows that if you don't have them retrieve that information in a very short period of time, then it will be lost. So we want to give them some information and then force them to retrieve it very quickly so that those schemas can be built and solidified, and then we come back the next lesson and we start our next lesson with a before activity that again forces them to retrieve that same information again. So it's this iterative loop of information encoding, and then we move it from our working memory into schema, into our long-term memory, and then we retrieve it over and over and over again. And that's how those complex schema end up being formed. So you want to revisit your objectives and your essential questions here, and you want to do so explicitly. You want to have maybe even verbatim those essential questions come back and be included in whatever strategy or activity you choose to do with this after segment of your lesson. Soliciting feedback, that's something that I really struggled with doing when I was in the classroom, and I think most of us do. You wait on those course evaluations at the end of the semester, and we all know that the response rate on those is pretty abysmal. So why not every now and then, and I'm not saying every lesson or even every week, but throughout the course of the semester, might not be a bad idea to, at the end of a lesson, when things are still fresh on their mind, throw an index card and say, hey, what was good, what was bad, what kind of suggestion do you have? Not just assessing them on the feedback, not just assessing them on the content of the day's lesson. That's definitely something you want to do here. But every now and then, assess them on your instructional practices, right? So solicit their feedback. See what they think about what you're doing, and see if they have any suggestions. And you may be surprised with some of the suggestions they give you. I've definitely got some suggestions from my students in the past that I've implemented, and some of them work very well, and some of them don't work at all. But it's always good to get that feedback from your students. So again, skipping over another Padlet activity there. So my after column looks very similar to my before column, and again I just use I just bold whatever strategy or tool I'm going to be using, and then a quick overview of how I'm using that tool or that strategy. And then for the handouts and interaction and engagement portion, again, this is more of just kind of an accountability measure, to where, again, if you don't see a whole lot of stuff down here by the time you get through planning, then that means you don't have any kind of handouts, any kind of guided notes or graphic organizers or concept maps or anything to keep your students kind of focused in and right there with you as you go throughout the lesson. And if you don't have anything over here, then that probably means that you're going to have a lot of napping students and students on their cell phones and things of that nature. If you don't plan to engage them, then they will not be engaged. So summarizing the kind of the high points here, planning creates structure and focus for your lesson and ultimately your course if you lesson plan consistently. The before, during, and after format promotes a thought process that's going to lead to better organized and more logical presentation of your content. And it also is going to, frequently bring out those areas of confusion and misconception that you want to surface beforehand, before you are in the lesson and in a room full of students. you can better address these issues, obviously, in the planning process than you can on the fly. Especially with maybe a new course that you're teaching that you possibly don't feel as comfortable with. There's nothing worse than that feeling of being up in front of a group of students and having some sort of curveball thrown at you and, sweating bullets and, just having to sometimes say, I don't know, which is much easier to do. It's much easier to say, I don't know, when you feel confident in your content, right? And when you've planned ahead of time, and just having spent that time planning a lot of times makes you feel better about saying, I don't know, because you know that, hey, there's, I've spent time planning this, and if I don't know, it's not because I didn't plan. I'll go find out and we'll talk about it next time. And then also, over the course of time, you're going to develop a nice wealth of resources. You're going to develop a nice toolkit of strategies to use to where eventually you can be like this cool guy kangaroo just hanging out. All right, so we had a couple more kind of interactive things there that we will skip over. I do want to share another link with you so that if you do go back and watch the recording of this, you can provide me with some feedback. So let me get this link here. And, that's not where I want it to be. Neither is that. There we go. Right, so I will share this link. Okay, so this is the sign-in link. And then if you do watch this recording, visit this link and provide me with some feedback on this lesson. And if you have any questions, or if you would like any other resources that I might be able to get my hands on, feel free to reach out to me, and don't hesitate to reach out with any sort of comments, questions, or additional feedback that you might want to give me above and beyond the survey. So that's all I have for this presentation, and I look forward to reading your feedback.